Hello, friends. Well, today, as you can see, I've got the Northern Lights um, as the background. So we've come down from outer space for a while, for a change. And also, this is a bit of a change. I'm going to read one of SATOW'S papers from, now, can you see that? Yes, you can you? The collected works of E.M. Sato, collected papers, 1880 to 1894. Um, I bought this 5 volume set. It was quite expensive, I have to say. When did I buy? 2008, February the 1st, 2008 is what it says in the front. Um, from Tokyo, from Edition Synapse. I have no idea if they still have any um, any of them. In the UK, this was Ganesha. Wait a minute, let's just check that. Ganesha Publishing, yeah. Which I think was London, yes. So honestly, I'm not sure, unless you look in a good library, whether you'd how you'd get hold of this anymore. But uh, what I want to do is to read to you one of the papers listed up here, and it is the last one, which is The Life of Buddha from the Journal of the Buddhist Text Society of India, Calcutta, 2, which I think is volume 2, part 3, 1894, appendix 1, 1 to 11. And it's actually 14 pages. So what I've done is, with a little bit of difficulty, because the text is like that. Whoops, you probably can't see that very well. Very close and dense text. So I have put that into a PDF, and I'm going to share the PDF and read from it at the same time, if that makes sense. Just a moment. Let's first do the share. Okay, I hope you can see that now. So I'm going to start reading now. Appendix 1, Life of Buddha from the Japanese. Now, I think it means it's a translation from the Japanese, which I will need to look into. But anyway, it's by E.M. Sato, Ernest Mason Sato Esquire, CMG, which, let me see, in 1894, I think or around that time, he still wasn't a KCMG. So he wasn't Sir Ernest Sato at that time. So here we go. And I'm going to struggle a bit with the size of this font, but hopefully I'll be able to read it all. Please forgive me if I stumble at all. I wonder if I can just get down to the bottom of the page, or just scroll down a little. You see, that's a problem. I can't scroll down a little bit. That is difficult. If I can, oh dear. Sorry, this is a bit of a. Okay, well, let's start and hope that things work out as we go along. Maybe I can make this a little larger. There we are. So, the subject of Japanese Buddhism naturally divides itself into 3 parts, which we shall take in the following order: the life of the founder of the religion, its introduction into Japan, and the tenets of the different sects. The Buddha was the son of Jobon Suddhodana, king of Kapilavastu, in Kosala. His family bore the alternative surnames of Gudon Gautama and Shaka Sakya, the former from the sugar cane which gave birth to Jobon's ancestor Zensei Susamhava, the latter from the place where he dwelt. Jobon espoused Kiyodomi Gantami, the eldest, and Maya Bunin, Maya, the youngest, daughters of another king of the Shaka race, named Zengaku Suprabuddha. As Maya Bunin was more beautiful than her elder sister and enjoyed a much greater share of the king's favor, Kiyodomi was racked with the pains of jealousy. King Jobon's rule was marked by benevolence, clemency, and justice, qualities which might have sufficed to ensure the happiness of his people. But owing to the want of religious and moral teaching, they were sunk in frivolity and vice. Their pitiable condition moved the compassion of Gome Daishi, Prabhapala, who inhabited the heaven called Tosotsu-ten, Tushta. Filled with an ardent desire to save mankind from their miseries, he cast his eyes downwards in search of a suitable spot whence he might carry out his merciful design. The virtues of King Jobon and his wife seemed to promise a favorable sphere of action in Kapira-jo, and descending from heaven upon central India with a retinue of devas and good spirits, he approached during the night the pavilion where Maya Bunin and her husband were reposing. That seems to be a misprint. Should be were reposing, not where reposing, I would think. Suddenly, the sound of sweet music attracted her attention. She raised her head and beheld a golden pagoda in the midst of a purple cloud which filled the sky. Whilst she gazed, the door of the pagoda opened and presented a golden Buddha seated within. Then a red-headed white elephant with 6 tusks made its appearance, carrying on its head a white lotus on which the Buddha took his seat. From the white spot on his forehead shone a brilliant light which illuminated the whole universe. Approaching her, he said, "Well done, Maya Bunin, I have something to announce to thee. Linked to thee already by a chain of causes which had their origin in the past, I have resolved to enter thy womb and so gain a passage into the world in order to bring salvation to mankind sunk in greedy desire and ignorance. It is my intention henceforward to adopt King Jobon for my father and thee for my mother, and thus to take humanity upon myself." Great fear fell upon Queen Maya, and bowing her head, she prayed to be relieved from the great honor of becoming the mother of a Buddha. But Gome Daishi soothed her fears, and alighting from the white elephant, passed into her bosom like a shadow. Then all the attendant devas and good spirits fell upon their knees and worshipped her as the mother of the Buddha, and as she was endeavoring to escape from them, she awoke. The king awoke at the same moment and told her he had had a remarkable vision which agreed exactly with her own, and they concluded that heaven had at last answered their prayers by bestowing on them a son. Shortly afterwards, it became evident that the queen was pregnant, and great was the joy of the king and his courtiers. I'll just make that a bit smaller so I can get to the end. The promised happiness of her sister only added fuel to the flames of jealousy which tortured Kyo-domimi. With the aid of her steward, Ba Shogun, she employed magic arts against the life of her rival in the king's affections. But the wicked design failed of its object. Ba Shogun committed suicide out of remorse, while Kyo-domi, sincerely repenting, became a noble and devoted woman from that moment. According to the ordinary form of the legend, the effect of the arts employed by Kyo-domi was to retard the child's birth for 3 years, but modern Japanese writers reject this as fabulous and believe the period of gestation to have been the same as in ordinary cases. Okay, that is page 1, but we have footnotes to look at, so let's go down there if we can. So there are the footnotes. The following account of the life of Sakyamuni is condensed from a Japanese popular work, the Shaka Jitsuroku. Okay, well, that's helpful. Shuka Jitsuroku, sorry. That's helpful anyway. The names in brackets are the Sanskrit equivalents. That's also very helpful. All right, so let's move on to the next page if we can. Let's see if doing that. Yes, okay, well, that seems to work. Good. It's a bit darker, but it's readable. I was struggling to make these scans, I can tell you. Okay. Oops, sorry. I don't remember what the bit before was. So do I have to go back? That's a bit of a problem. Perhaps I better do that and see what I can find. Sorry about this messing around, but it's quite tricky. Yeah, okay. Whoop. that's a, oh, hang on, that's 3. Why is that 3? Hang on. Why should that be 3? That's strange. Let me just, ah. Oh, I see, because the second page is a double page, so I have to go over to this. Yes. Oh, okay. Now I understand. Right. Sorry. I was forgetting that it's a double page, except for the first page. All right, continuing. One night in a dream, the Buddha appeared to Mayabunin in the form of an infant, and prostrating himself before her, begged pardon for the evil he had brought upon her. He explained to her the 3 privileges enjoyed by mankind. 1, that of being born in human form, the crown and roof of things. 2, the endowment with the knowledge of good and evil. 3, the power of penetrating into the constitution of things in themselves. These 3 blessings could only be retained by the observance of 10 rules. 1, condescension towards inferiors in station. 2, condescension towards inferiors in intellect and understanding. 3, leniency towards the wicked. 4, charity to the poor. 5, goodness to the unfortunate. 6, perseverance in spite of difficulty. 7, forbearance to the untruthful. 8, compassion for the deformed. 9, patience with the ignorant. And 10, recognition of the law of causation and consequent forgiveness of injuries. This last was the great law of cause and effect, ingwa, by reason of which every action was followed by its due recompense or punishment according to its nature, just as the fruit of a tree was dependent upon the nature of its root. To steal was a cause. The discovery of crime and punishment was the effect. In the same way, charity and goodness were rewarded in the end by happiness and prosperity. A man's actions in his previous existence could thus be explained by his condition in this, and the conduct in this life was an index to the future state in the next life. He who sows a good seed will gather good fruit. If he plants a bad seed, bad will be the fruit thereof. Everyone, being the master of his own actions, can choose for himself whether he will be happy or miserable. Mankind, however, imagine that they can reap happiness where they have sown wickedness. They are as foolish as a peasant who plants millet seed and expects it to produce a crop of rice. A knowledge of this great truth should enable man to overcome hatred of his neighbor. How foolish are those who are moved by the passions of joy, anger, sorrow, and pleasure of this brief span of existence, who are led away by the passion of love or emulate their fellows in the pursuit of fame or riches, without ever performing a single good action, and make no preparation for the life to follow. This is because they are ignorant of the impermanency of this fleeting existence, which perishes like the hoarfrost of morning or the dew of evening. Thou who art the wife of a king, and art lodged in golden halls and marble towers, clad in rich garments, art not less evanescent than the light and shade of a winter's day. That which is born must surely die, and by this law thou must become dust of the earth. Pray, therefore, that thou mayest be able to sever the ties of affections, and, attaining to Buddhaship, enter into the perfect bliss of nirvana. With these words, he passed again within her bosom. Mayabunin was utterly free from the 3 vices of greed, anger, and stupidity, and having now obtained knowledge of the truth, constantly observed the 8 prohibitions and practiced the 6 cardinal virtues. Well, let's go. Okay, now we want to. Sorry, it's a bit tricky. There we are. Can we move over a bit to the left? Yeah. And then maybe make it a bit larger again. Yeah. Okay. The period for the birth of the child now being at hand, The king commands that a great festival of all his people be held in the ancestral gardens of the Rambini Park, Lumbini Garden. Within it lay a lake as large as a sea, with rockwork of diamonds, crystal, and lapis lazuli, and the paths which traversed it in all directions were strewn with the precious jambu gold, believed to fall in the form of dew from the jambu trees on Shumisen, Mount Meru. Cranes standing on the margin of the water and tortoises expanding their tails on the rocks offer felicitous suggestions of the crowning blessings of long life, while rare trees and exotic plants arise on every hand. Among them is the beautiful sorrellus tree, Muyuju or Asoka, bearing countless gorgeous blossoms which exhale delicious odors. Here the peacock displays its gorgeous plumage, and the Kuriobinga bird, Kalnvinka, utters its melodious note. In the midst of the garden rises a magnificent palace constructed of precious woods and adorned with the rarest gems and precious stones. Here the banquet is served to the king and queen. Then, warmed with wine, in generous mood, he bids his courtiers each to pluck a flower, promising a rich reward to him whose choice shall be approved by Maya Bunin. They plunge into the garden and return laden with blossoms, which they lay at the feet of the queen. The king then begs Maya Bunin to fetch him a flower of the sorrellus tree. She leaves her seat and, approaching the tree, raises her right arm towards a branch. When her robe opens, and from her right side, the promised infant is born into the world. And then we have the footnotes. 1. The 8 prohibitions, hakkai, are 1. Taking life, 2. Theft, 3. Fornication, 4. Lying, 5. Wine drinking, 6. Lying in a large bed. Oh dear. 7. Personal ornaments, 8. Dancing and singing. And the 6 cardinal virtues, roku haramitsu in Japanese, Sanskrit 6 paramita, are 1. Charity, 2. Morality, 3. Patience, 4. Energy, 5. Tranquil contemplation, and 6. Wisdom. I wonder if paramita has anything to do with parameter. Well, anyway, just by the by, probably not. Number 2, this footnote number 2 is said to be the origin of the so-called Hanamido, or flower palace, which forms part of the decorations of a Japanese Buddhist temple at the celebration of the birth of Buddha on April the 8th. And number 3, see the plate in Journal and Text, Volume 1, Part 2. Okay, so from is the last word on this page, and we have to go over to the next page, remembering that the first word is from the oops. Okay, let's get this out of the way. From the earth at her feet springs a blue lotus flower, large as a chariot wheel, upon which the infant sinks, radiating from his body a brilliant light that illuminates the universe. At the same moment, the heavens open, and there appear the 4 kings of the Devas, bearing a robe of damask, while the 2 Naga kings, Nanda and Upananda, eject from their mouths streams of water, which descend upon the head of the newborn child. Next, all the Devas and Bodhisattvas descend and worship him. The 4 kings of the Devas, Taishaku, Bonten, and the 2 Naga kings reascend to heaven. The child descends from the lotus flower, and having taken 3 steps forward and 4 backwards, points with his right hand to heaven, with his left to the earth, and pronounces these words with the voice of a lion. I alone, of all beings in heaven above and under the heavens, am worthy of honor. Maya Bunin, who was thus delivered of her burden without pain, sat down beneath the tree, and at her side there welled forth a spring of the purest water. The infant was given in charge of his aunt Kiyodomi to nurse. On the following day, Jobonno, accompanied by a train of courtiers, took the child to worship at the temple of Bonten. The image of the god arose and kissed the infant's feet, explaining to the astonished king that the babe was worthy of honor by all beings, including the heavenly spirits of space. 7 years later, the queen died. Her body was consumed by fire, and the ashes being collected were placed in a vase. The place she had inhabited was removed to the Mount of the Evening Sun, and the vase deposited therein. Close by a pagoda, 160 feet in height, was erected in her honor, and the sorreless tree was transported from the garden and planted in front of the mausoleum. Shitta-taishi, Prince Siddhartha, was the name given to the young child, who was tenderly cared for by his aunt Kyodomi. 32 of the most lovely women of the Shaka race were appointed to wait on him, 8 to carry him in their arms by turns, 8 to wash him, 8 to give him milk, and 8 for his amusement. He grew so rapidly that when 3 years old, he had the appearance of a boy of twice that age, while his conduct and intelligence were those of a grown-up man. At the age of 8, he was placed under the tuition of the Brahman Mitra, and a boy named Udayin, was chosen to be his companion. He clearly exhibited an inclination for religious meditation. In a short time, he had learnt all that his teacher was able to impart and returned to his palace. Here he was visited by the Rishi Ashita, who recognized in him the 32 signs of a perfect Buddha and foretold that he would become the savior of mankind. The king asked whether Shitta-taishi would not first reign over his kingdom before retiring into the ranks of the holy. But the rishi refused to answer, giving as his excuse that he must not reveal the designs of heaven. Okay, let's try go down. Well, okay. Jubon, in order to turn away his what? Sorry, I can't read that. I need to get this out of the way. Oh dear. Sorry, Jobon, not Jubon. Jobon, in order to turn away his son from his unworldly ideas, surrounded him with 5,000 of the most beautiful girls to be found throughout the kingdom, and endeavored to amuse him with the pleasures of sense, so that he might forget his intention of retiring from the world, but all in vain. Then he lodged him in a palace surrounded with a beautiful park, and provided him with companions of his own age, amongst whom was his cousin, Devadatta. One day, as the prince and his friends were engaged in shooting at a target, a flock of wild geese flew overhead, and Devadatta discharged his arrow amongst them, wounding one and bringing it to the ground in front of Shitta-taishi. The youth was filled with pity for the useless pain inflicted, and lifting the helpless bird, extracted the arrow and bound up the wound. At this moment he was rejoined by Devadatta, who demanded the goose as his own property. The prince calmly gazed upon him and replied, "I admire your skill, but surely having exhibited your wonderful accuracy of aim to us, you cannot have any further interest in the bird. Give it to me, I pray." Devadatta shook his head. "No. However much you may wish to keep it, I am not disposed to yield my quarry to another. I am going to take it home and shall eat it. Give it back to me at once." Shitta-taishi answered, "To rejoice in the destruction of life is the act of a wild animal, and a human being, the crown of creation, should be ashamed of such a deed. No one has a right to take the life of a bird for his own pleasure. That you shot it and that it fell at my feet is the result of the chain of cause and effect. I hope to tend it and restore it to life, and I will only give it back to you if it dies." So saying, he stroked the bird's wings 2 or 3 times with his beautiful hands till it revived, and springing to the ground, seemed to make obeisance to its deliverer. Then, spreading its wings in flight, it was, and that's the next page, footnotes 1, also called Utsuran Hotsu or Udrarama Patra. And number 2, the birth of the Buddha is usually placed by the Chinese and Japanese in the year 1027 BC, but the date accepted in Europe is 653 BC. Some of the Japanese, however, fix it in 742 BC, E.M. Sato. Okay, then spreading its wings in flight, it was. And so we have to go to the next page if I can find. Okay. I think I have to go to the left. Yes, I do. It's a double page, or a scan of 2 pages. So let's see what we can do with this now. It was speedily lost to view. This adventure gave great umbrage to the proud Daibadatta, who quitted the park with his followers, and from that time forward became the bitter enemy of the prince, whom he already disliked on account of his marvelous superiority in all feats of skill and strength. At the age of 15, Shitta Taishi was formally recognized as heir apparent and was henceforth obliged to live in greater state than before, but he preferred the intercourse of books to all earthly delights, and his constant talk was of the preparation for the hereafter and the sinfulness of taking life. Lest he should carry out his intention of forsaking the world without leaving an heir to continue the life of the Sakyas, it was determined to marry him. The lovely Yasodhara was selected, some say by himself, out of a large number led before him, and their nuptials were celebrated with royal pomp. For a while, the society of his bride appeared to have turned his thoughts in a new direction. 3 magnificent palaces had been built for him to occupy in turn during the 3 seasons of winter, summer, and rains into which the year was divided. To prevent the predictions of the soothsayers and the Rishi Ashita from being fulfilled, a huge wall was drawn round the prince's park with 4 iron gates, strongly guarded day and night by soldiers, while sentinels constantly patrolled the enceinte to hinder any attempt to escape. In spite of the endeavours thus made by his father and all around him to wean the prince from his intention of quitting the world, the desire seemed only to grow stronger upon him. To distract his thoughts, it was arranged that he should pay a visit to the king at the Rambini garden. As the cortege left the eastern gate, Shitta Taishi's notice was attracted to an aged beggar who, endeavouring to approach the palanquin, was rudely beaten by the guards and knocked down. Struck by the emaciated appearance of the old man, whose limbs refused to support him in a vain attempt to rise, the prince began to reflect on the shortness of life and the lightning speed of its course from infancy to decrepit old age. Then, overcome by sadness, he ordered the bearers to carry him back to the palace. Yeah. Whoops. I want to try and go down. Can I go down? Yes. Good, but that's then in the way again. Let's make it a bit smaller, maybe, if I can. And move over. Yeah. A second time he set forth to visit his father. Every precaution was taken to keep the route clear of anything that might offend the eye or shock the feelings, but he had not gone far when he fell in with a man lying in the road, wasted to a skeleton by the ravages of disease and presenting a loathsome spectacle. Shitta Taishi began immediately to reflect that this sickly object had once been the possessor of perfect health, but by overindulgence of the appetites his power had been wasted and destroyed, till at last he had fallen a victim to disease and death. It seemed to him that a like destiny menaced the poor and rich, the mean and noble, in the same degree because of their want of self-control, their passions, and their pride. Again he sank into melancholy, but bidding his physician to attend to the beggar, continued on his way to the palace. When evening fell, he mounted his horse and, issuing from the western gate of the garden, proceeded homewards. The Devajoko Ten Sudavasa, who had by 2 successive transformations presented to the prince's eyes the shapes of disease and old age, was resolved to give him a 3rd lesson on the vanity of human existence, but fearing that the guards should prevent him, rendered himself invisible to all but Shitta Taishi and his confidential follower Udai. Assuming the form of a corpse, he lay down in the road, unperceived by the escort as they passed. But the prince, seeing him, called to Udai, saying, "Behold that dead man! His fleeting breath and his soul are sped. The elements of which his body was composed are undergoing dissolution. All men, from the king to the meanest subject, must end thus. We spend our little span of life in the pleasures of sense, or abandon ourselves to the pursuit of riches, forgetful that impermanence is the general characteristic of all things earthly, and in a moment's brief space we must give place to others." Udai hastily seized the bridle and led the prince away, but the latter having, and that's on the next page, continues. So the footnote 1, the Japanese author rejects the story of Shitta Taishi's contest with 8 other princes for Yasudara's hand on the ground that it was one of his principles to avoid any notion which could incite a feeling of rivalry and disappointment. On the other hand, he accepts the tradition that though Shitta had 2 other wives besides Yasudara, he never knew them. Had he not been both a husband and a father and known the joys of earthly affection, he would have sacrificed nothing. It was this very sacrifice that enabled him to attain to perfect knowledge and open the eyes of mankind to their miserable condition. It is the example of the Buddha himself that justifies the practice of marriage among the priests of the Ikkoshu. Although the monk is not obliged to imitate the most venerable Ono in all circumstances of his life before he attained to knowledge, Shinran Shonin thought it better to make this concession to the weakness of the flesh than to incur the risk of one man bringing disgrace upon the whole order by licentious disregard of a too strict rule of life. Okay, so before we go to the next page, I'll read the last sentence again. Udai hastily seized the bridle and led the prince away, but the latter having, and now we have to go to the other side of this double page, or double sheet, I should say. There we are, and let's go up. Yeah. Now being face to face with old age, illness, and death, was more than ever confirmed in his resolve to seek the way of salvation. When search was made for the aged mendicant, the sick man and the corpse, no traces of them could be found, and the conclusion impressed itself on all that the hand of some spiteful demon had here been at work. Not long afterwards, the prince, feeling his long confinement irksome, went forth into the country. On reaching an open spot, he dismissed his retinue, and sitting down beneath an old jambu tree, with his eyes closed, his legs crossed, and his hands folded, endeavored to attain to a condition of complete mental tranquillity. Suddenly he was accosted by a monk clad in the Kesa Kashaya, who held a pilgrim's staff, shakujo, yes, shakujo, in one hand, and a begging bowl, teppatsu, in the other. This was no other than Joko Ten, who had taken upon himself the duty of guiding the future Buddha in the path towards salvation. On being interrogated, he replied, "The monk, bhikshu, is one who follows the rule of poverty, severs the ties of parental and marital affection, and escaping from the law of metempsychosis, lives a pure and unsullied life. He has no other property than his own body. His staff is the instrument which aids him in the performance of the rites. He rattles it as a safeguard against drowsiness and to give notice to others of the road to wisdom. The bowl is to hold his food, which he begs from house to house. You will ask, why must I cast away the affections and endeavor to escape from the metempsychosis? I will tell you. Man, though conscious of the imminence of old age, disease, and death, remains drifting about in the misery of successive existences, and is ignorant of the means of attaining to the perfect joys of infinite wisdom. By the practice of poverty, you may learn to renounce all the pleasures of the senses, and while the heart disports itself in the pure and holy path, escape from the sea of the 8 miseries is made easy, until at length you reach the haven of nirvana." Man is like a wretch who has fallen into a well and strives in anguish to support himself by the aid of a tuft of grass which juts out from the side. Below lies coiled a huge serpent with gaping jaws. A ferocious tiger watches above with open mouth, impatient to devour him if he ascends, and an army of rats gnaw the roots of the grass. In such a position, neither wife nor child, treasures nor exalted rank can help him, and if the keen-edged blast of impermanency strikes upon him, he is deprived of all in a moment. With these words he rose into the air, radiating from his person a golden light, and disappeared from view. Then the prince understood that a spiritual being had appeared to tell him of the blessed state of the man who has gone out from his home and family. Shukke, Sanskrit, abhinishikramana. Yeah, shukke is Japanese, leaving home and family. And resolving to devote himself thenceforth to the study of incomparable wisdom, in order that he might convert both men and devas, he returned homewards in a state of beatific ecstasy. Chitta Taishi now determined to search for a teacher who would be able to impart to him the necessary knowledge. One night, as he was reposing by the side of Yashodhara, he suddenly heard a melodious voice calling upon him to quit home and family. He arose at once, and casting his robe over his wife, who seemed to sleep like one dead, made his way forth through the crowds of sleeping attendants. The doors, as he opened them, made not the slightest sound, though purposely constructed to give warning when anyone passed through. Betaking himself to the stable, he roused his groom, Shanoku Chandaka, and ordered him to lead forth the horse, Konjoku Kantaka. As if divining the prince's purpose, the iron doors swung noiselessly upon their hinges, and the heir of the Sakyas went forth, guided by the invisible hosts of the devas and good spirits, past the sentinels who were sleeping on their posts. Leaving behind him, without a sigh or a regret, the magnificent palace where he had passed his youth, he abandoned father, mother, wife, and child, and set forth in the direction of Dandokusen, Dantalokagiri, full of his mission of redemption. By dawn, he was already at the foot of the mountain where the spirits left him. He felt inspired to hope that by climbing to the summit, he might perchance fall in with some spiritual being who could teach him the path of wisdom and nirvana. Stroking the steed's forehead, he promised that if he ever should attain to perfect knowledge, he would help the faithful beast to escape from the animal cycle. Then turning to Shanoku, he commanded him to return to the city and inform the king of the step he had taken. Suddenly a rustling was heard among the trees, and a hunter issued forth, holding in his hand a bow and arrow and wearing a yellow robe. Presenting these to the prince, he disappeared from view, leaving behind him an odor of fragrant incense. The stranger being was Joko Ten in human form. Chitta Taishi, putting on the miserable hempen garment and thrusting the arrow into his hair, took the bow into his hand and began to ascend barefoot the rugged path towards the summit of the mountain. And the footnotes: 1, the path that leads to the extinction of passion belief, in which is the fourth of the so-called Four Noble Truths. And 2, it is this renunciation of all worldly joys and comforts for hardship and privation that the Japanese ascetics of later ages have endeavored to imitate by making pilgrimages. Next page. So go to the left because it's a double again. All right, good. Oops. On the following morning, it was discovered, to the general dismay, that the prince had disappeared with his horse and man. The gates and doors were found closed and barred, while the walls and ditch were known to be insurmountable except by supernatural aid. Parties were sent out to scour the country in all directions, and Shanoku was met, leading back the horse with slow and reluctant step. He delivered the prince's message and recounted the story of the flight, the miraculous rapidity of their journey to the mountain, and the apparition of the hunter. But scarcely one believed his report except the king, who comprehended that the portents which had accompanied Shita-Taishi's birth were now fulfilled, in spite of all the efforts he had made to counteract them. Yashodhara now recalled to mind the prince's words spoken on the night before his departure, foretelling that she should bear a child within her bosom for 6 years, and became aware that she was pregnant. But her state remained unperceived by others for 4 years. She was afraid, however, to repeat what Shita-Taishi had predicted, lest she should not be believed. At last, when it could be concealed no longer from the notice of her handmaidens, she became the object of very natural suspicions on the part of those about her, including even the king and her aunt Kiyodomi. And at the instance of the wicked cousin Daibadatta, she was placed in confinement until, by the return of Shita-Taishi, the truth might become manifest. 18 months later, she gave birth to a boy who was named Rahula. 6 years, according to the accepted story, after the flight of his father. So the first name is Japanese, Ragora, and then Rahula is Sanskrit, I think, if I've got that right. Let's try and move down a bit. Yeah, oh, that's lucky. Okay. Wrapped in his monkish garments and leaning on his bow, the prince unfalteringly pursued his way up the mountain until, after overcoming insuperable obstacles, he reached its snow-clad summit. Here he found an old man with a human face and the bones of a crane, clad in a garment of leaves and seated in a meditative posture with closed eyes. Believing that he had at last discovered the teacher of whom he was in search, he waited until the strange being awoke from his trance and announced his desire to perform the exercises which he believed were necessary for the attainment of nirvana. "I am the Risse Arada," he replied. "It is no easy task for the unregenerate man to attain incomparable wisdom and to rescue mankind from their miserable condition. Then must first practice self-mortification. Thou must first practice self-mortification." The prince heard these words with joy, and submitting to the tonsure, registered a solemn vow to abandon all human passions. Under the name of Gudo Shami, the Sramana or novice Gautama, he applied himself diligently to the rigid observance of the 2,500 prohibitions, cheerfully submitting to the greatest privations and hardships in the hope of attaining perfect knowledge. With no other food than wild fruits and pure water for his drink, the prince continued the ascetic practices which alone could purify him from desire, at first under the guidance of Arara Sen and then under the tuition of Karara Sen, the rishi Kalama or Karama, who taught him the 3 kinds of truth. For 100 days and nights he continued seated without moving, and for equal space of time he remained standing without once sitting down. Then for a third period of same length, he lay prostrate on the ground. During this time he neither slept, thought, nor spoke, nor a drop of water passed his lips, and his sustenance was a single fruit or nut. In this way he became worn to a skeleton, his skin was scorched by the blazing sun, and there was no relief either from the parching heat of summer nor the frosts of winter. 6 years passed away in these fruitless attempts to discover the existence of religious truth, until at last he awoke to the consciousness that this was not the way to attain to everlasting peace. Quitting his teachers, he betook himself to Zodrusen, where he passed another 6 years in fruitless attempts to subdue his nature. All night long he remained seated on a hard stone in an attitude of meditation, while his days were spent in toiling over the precipitous side of the mountain with no other nutriment than a single grain of sesame. At first he was assailed by poisonous serpents and ferocious beasts, but the bow of mercy and the arrow of compassion given him by the strange hunter effectually kept them at a distance until finally they were converted from their murderous appetites. Then Mara, king of the demons, alarmed for the security of his rule over human beings, assumed the form of a beautiful woman and endeavored to seduce his senses. But he had now, by long practiced austerities, attained to miraculous powers of insight, and striking the fiend on the head with the arrow of compassion, forced him to reassume his real shape. Then, sorry, that bit there is from the previous page's footnote. To the loftiest mountains in their country, the more difficult the ascent, the greater their merit. Okay. But for the footnotes for this page, number 1, thus arose the practice of shaving the head, which afterwards became one of the distinctive marks of the Buddhist neophyte. The first Japanese who underwent this rite was Tasun. Is that Tasun? Son of Shiba Tatsu. In the reign of Sujun Tempo, 188 to 592. Gosh, that's a very long reign, is it not? Sujun Tenno, Emperor Sujun. How can anybody have reigned that long? Number 2, this is the process taught by Dharma and still practiced by the Zen sect with the necessary modifications. Okay. So let's move on to the next page. We've got the first word from this page is then. So we have to slide over and go to the top of the page. If we can, yes. And then get this thing out of the way, whatever it, oh no, looks like we don't need it. Don't need to. Okay, then all the hosts of hell surrounded him with sword and spear, and raising a tumult that shook heaven and earth, endeavored to hinder his meditations, but in vain. In spite of this prolonged endeavor to obtain the truth by mortification of the flesh and spirit, the novice Gautama felt that he was no nearer the goal than at first. This was clearly not the way to obtain deliverance. He resolved, therefore, to take food before further attempting the pursuit of knowledge, and betook himself to the banks of the Nironga, Nairanjana. As he bathed there, a wooden sotoba stupa came floating towards him, inscribed with the words, "All phenomena are impermanent, because they are subject to the law of origination and perishing. When this law of origination and perishing comes to an end, calm, i.e. nirvana, will be found to be true happiness." Footnote 2. He recognized at once in these lines the essential... Oh dear, I've just lost it now. He recognized at once in these lines the essential truth of which he was in quest, and the scales fell from his mental sight. Burying his bow and arrow on the spot, he planted over them a sotoba, which afterwards, that's a stupa, isn't it? Which afterwards was transformed into a splendid edifice of gold, said to be still in existence. The Buddha now descends from the mountains, being in his 30th year, and the date the 8th of the 12th moon. 12th month, that would be. As he passed through the village of Zensei, Susambhava in Magadha, the people prepared for him a golden dish of rice boiled in milk, and awaited his coming in order to give him the title of World-Honored One, the Tathagata Sakyamuni. Kneeling down, they presented the food to him. Having partaken of it, he pronounced these words, "May the benefactors of the three precious ones have peace, health, prosperity, and long life in this world, and in the world to come. May they be born as men or devas to be the recipients of all joys." Thence he proceeded to the Rokuya-on, Mrigadava, and expounded the doctrines of the Four Truths, Arya Satya, which conduct man to the state of Arhat. These are as follows. 1. Suffering. 2. The generation of suffering. 3. The destruction of suffering. 4. The path leading to the destruction of suffering. Under the first two are explained the connection of cause and effect between actions in the previous life of those who are in the world and their consequences in the present, ingwa, or inga, I suppose in modern Japanese perhaps, cause and effect. suffering being the effect, generation its cause. The third and fourth truths describe the connection of cause and effect when the world is abandoned, destruction of suffering here being the fruit, and the path leading to its destruction, the cause. Let's move down a bit. This is in fact the kernel of Gautama's teaching, that life as we know it is but misery, which misery arises from the natural impulses. There's another misprint, impulses of the heart and body, and that escape from this misery is only possible by the destruction of its cause. In other words, that pure happiness is only to be attained of desire and feeling until the thinking substance attains, after a series of transmigrations, to a condition of perfect rest and tranquility, undisturbed beatitude, in a word, to nirvana. Next, he quitted the park for the town of Harayetsu, Varanasi. Well, I know that place, or know of that place. It's in India, real place, isn't it? Visiting on the way 3 rishis named Urabin Kasho, Uruvilva Kusyapa, Gaya Kasho, Gaya Kasyapa, and Nadai Kasho, Nadi Kasyapa, famous for their power of working miracles. Skeptical as to the teaching of the Buddha, they subjected him to severe tests of endurance, but finding that he came unharmed out of the very fiercest trials, they became converted and eventually attained to the degree of Rakan, Arhat. The fame of this story coming to the ears of King Bimbisara of Magadha, the latter invited the Buddha to his palace to preach the doctrine of cause and effect, and was so deeply impressed that he pardoned all the criminals in his dominions and gave, and that goes to the next page, and now we have footnotes. 1, as Mr. Eitel puts it, liberating oneself from all subjective and objective trammels and attaining to a state of liberty which leads to nirvana. 2, this is an attempt at rendering the often quoted lines Shogyo Mujo Zesho Meppo Sho Metsu Metsu I Juku Metsu Iraku. The meaning of which is embodied in the Iroha, or arrangement of the Japanese syllabary, invented, it is said, by Kobo Daishi and taught to every Japanese child as its first lesson. Number 3, this is an incident in his life often depicted by the Buddhist artists under the title of Shussan no Shaka, or Sakya issuing from the mountains. Okay, Shussan would be Deru and Yama, so leaving the mountains, I suppose. The Buddha, the law or religion, and the fraternity of monks. And number 5, condition immediately preceding nirvana. Okay, so I'll read that final sentence again, just before we go on to the next page. The fame of this story coming to the ears of King Bimbisara of Magadha, the latter invited the Buddha to his palace to preach the doctrine of cause and effect, and was so deeply impressed that he pardoned all the criminals in his dominions and gave. Now we have to go to the next page. Oh, where is it? Oh, there we are. So, and then we have to, that's on the right side of it. So back we go over to this side. Gave away very large sums in charity. Crowds of people flocked to hear the teacher, and the king built the monastery of Chikurin Shoja, Karadan Venuvana Vihara. Karanda Venuvara Vana. Let's try that again. Karanda Venuvana Vihara. Chikurin is bamboo forest, isn't it? For him and his disciples, who now numbered several hundreds. Now there was a man named Sharihotsu Saripatra in Sanskrit, the son of a woman called Shari, Sarika, or butcher bird, from the keenness of her vision, who by the practice of asceticism had acquired miraculous powers. But after hearing the doctrine of the Buddha, he enrolled himself among the disciples of Sakyamuni, bringing with him his friend Mokuron, Mordgalyayana. Sharihotsu was afterwards known as the wisest among the 10 great disciples, Jindai Deshi. Is that Jin or Ju? Jin, isn't it? Jindai Deshi. His next adherent of importance was the Brahmin Maka Kasho, Maha Kasyapa, more usually styled simply Kasho. In Japanese, I would think, yeah. The Buddha now called to mind his former abandonment of father, foster mother, and wife to go in search of salvation, and resolved that he would visit them in order to communicate the glad tidings. So, departing from the Chikurin Shoja, he journeyed towards his native city, teaching the multitude as he went. Amongst his converts, the most conspicuous was King Haruri Vaidurya of Barabasad, who fain would have detained the teacher, but the desire of the latter to reach home was not to be overcome. To help the king to remain in the path he had chosen, the Buddha directed him to take 108 seeds of the Bodaiju, Ficus religiosa, and threading them on a string to repeat the words Namu Daruma, Namu Sogya, Hail Buddha, Hail Religion, Hail Fraternity of the Monks, passing a bead each time between his fingers. This he was to do 200,000 times daily, and the reward promised was purification of the heart in this life and birth hereafter in Toriten, the Triyatstrimsa heaven. 1,000,000 times would be required in order to escape from the 108 kinds of depravity and attain to everlasting joy. This is the origin of the Buddhist rosary. Accompanied by his hundreds of disciples, the teacher drew near to the frontier of Kapira, begging their food as they went. The king was overcome with joy as one who had found an udumbara flower, when he learned that Shitta Taishi had finished his studies and was now returning as the beloved and honored Shakyamuni Nyorai, Sakyamuni Tathagata. He dispatched a messenger with a carriage to beg him to come to the palace from the house of a rich man named Karyo Choja. Question, Kala Sreshthin, possibly, where he had taken up his abode. The Buddha replied that he was no longer a prince, that it was not the tie of relationship that induced him to revisit his old home, but the desire of saving all living beings. He would therefore simply come in the same humble dress as his 1,500 disciples. On approaching the city of Kapira, he turned aside to the mausoleum of his mother with his followers. We have to go down a bit. Yeah. Okay. The king now arrived, accompanied by Kiyodomi, the secondary wives of Shitta Taishi, and the whole of his court, but they were unable to recognize the gaunt and sunburnt Sramana among the crowd of men clad in black dresses of wisteria fiber and scarves, kesa, of leaves knitted together. Yashodhara had obtained permission to mingle with the women of the palace and led by the hand her little boy of 6 years. Giving to the child the robe which the prince had thrown over her couch on the night of his departure, she bade him present it to the father of whom they had so often spoken in secret. Guided by unerring instinct, the boy passed through the crowd of people in spite of angry words and looks from the courtiers, and walking straight up to the company of holy monks, fell on his knees before the Arhat Rakan, who occupied the third seat, and offered him the robe. The Rakan took the garment in his hands, and as he pronounced with a clear voice the words, unchangeable truth of the universal law, mysterious insight and state of unconditionedness, the wisdom and the prayer of all beings are both fulfilled, his countenance was transfigured, while the tuft of white hairs on his forehead radiated forth a brilliant light, illuminating the spacious hall. Then the whole company fell on their knees and worshipped, while the 1,500 Rakan, rising from their seats, uttered with one voice the salutation, Hail, O Tathagata Sakyamuni. Then he pronounced a charm, and behold, the garment the child had presented to him was found to be embroidered with the words, 6 years after my departure, thou shalt have a lovely boy who shall be a sage from his birth. Thus the king and all his courtiers saw how they had unjustly suspected the princess, and her innocence was made as clear as the noonday. The Buddha now assembles the whole of the Shaka family and expounds to them the doctrine of cause and effect, Inga, or Ingwa. I think the romanization in modern days, it would be Inga. And the effects of Hanya, Pragua, or wisdom, the highest of the 6 paramita. Amongst the more important of the converts made were his cousins Ananda, Anaritsu, Aniruddha, Bhattadara, Bhadra, and Ubarimitsu, Upali. Daiba alone remained obstinately hostile to the new doctrine. The Buddha changed the name of Sekiyo-san to Makumaya-san and converted the mausoleum into a monastery under the name of Tori Tenshoji. Here he expounded I'll go to the next, over the other side. Here he expounded up we go, the Fubo, Ho-on-kyo, the Daihanya-kyo, Mahaprajna Sutra, and the Hoshin Hoshakyo, and the number of his disciples grew from day to day. After this, the Buddha established another monastery on Mount Ryojusen, Grulbra-kura, whither the young and old of both sexes flocked to hear his teachings. It was here that King Bimbashara caused to be constructed a flight of steps 5 leagues in length and 10 paces wide in the course of a few days, so that believers might ascend the mountain without fatigue. Daiba now took counsel with a magician named Myoken to besiege Ryojusen and destroy the Buddha together with his disciples. Seeing that his followers nevertheless began to lose heart, Shakyamuni summoned to his aid all the devas and good deities. With banners waving, gongs and cymbals beating, Kasho led them against the demons, who fled in all directions without striking a blow. It is in memory of this occasion that banners are suspended in some Buddhist temples and that gongs are beaten during the recitation of the scriptures. Naruhodo, I see. Daiba and Myoken were taken prisoners and brought before the Buddha, who expounded to them his doctrines, but without effect. Then Mokuren let loose on them a multitude of insects armed with sharp stings, until Myoken, crying for pardon, reassumed his natural form of a bull and fell dead, bequeathing his hide to be used in making a drum to frighten away the foes of Buddhism. Daiba, on beholding the miracle, was filled with remorse for his sins. He submitted to have his head shaven, and donning the mantle of the ascetic, became one of the Buddha's disciples under the name of Chodatsu. Let's move down a little, if we can. There we are. Okay. Maya Bunin, the Buddha's mother, for her great virtues during her previous state of existence, had been rewarded by elevation to Toriten, Trayastrimsa, where she was adopted by Taishakuten, Indra. She attained to the knowledge of the 3 elementary truths and acquired the 6 kinds of supernatural powers. Accompanied by his disciples Kasho and Sharihotsu, the Buddha ascended to Toriten upon a golden cloud and expounded to his mother and Taishaku the Ho-on-kyo. The former presented him in return with the mandara flower, Mandarava Pushpa, which he wore in her hair. From this incident, it is said to have originated the practice of offering flowers before a Buddhist shrine. During his absence, which lasted 3 months, the faithful in this world felt as if plunged in utter darkness and lamented him like a lost parent. At the command of the 2 kings, Uten, Udayana, and Bimbisara, the sculptor Bishu Katsunya Visvakarman, whose skill was believed to be so great that the wooden animals and birds that came from his hand were endowed with the power of motion, and who from frequent attendance on the teachings of the Buddha had come to know every line of his countenance, carved a likeness of him in wood 5 feet 2 inches high. When it was finished, the two kings installed it in the principal hall of the Ryojusen monastery. It was afterwards removed to Gyeonshoja, the Jetavana Vihara. When the Buddha returned from Toriten, Trayastrimsa heaven, to Ryojusen, the wooden image came forth to meet him. Shaka spoke to it, saying, "My nirvana is at hand. Thou shalt take my place in converting mankind." And they walked back in company into the building with a wooden image. Interesting. The number of the Buddha's disciples now increased with great rapidity. Amongst them, the chief ones are known as the 10 great disciples, Judai Deshi. Yes, it's not Jindai Deshi, it's Judai Deshi. So that was a misprint before. The 16 Rakan and the 500 Rakan. The 10 are Kasho, Anan, Sharibotsu, Mokuren, Anaritsu, Shubodai, Furuna, Kasenyen, Ubari Mitsu, and the Buddha's son, Ragora, all of them noted for some distinctive powers. In Sanskrit, Kasyapa, Ananda, Sariputra, Maudgalyayana, Aniruddha, Subhuti, Purna, Katyayana, Upali, and Rahula. Well, as long as there are no misprints, I hope that's fairly close to the original. The 16 Rakan are Batsura Tasha, Kyadakaha, Takaharida, Sohinda, Takura, Batdara, Kari, Hotara. Then the footnotes. 1. The Sanskrit title has not been identified. 2. In modern times, the drum as a means of repelling the assaults of the demons was chiefly used in Japan by the Hokke sect, founded by Nichiren. 3. This is a mistake of the Japanese author. The two Japanese forms are merely different ways of reading the Sanskrit name Devadatta, BN. I wonder who BN is. Number 4. The former are 1. The impermanency of existence. 2. The miserable condition of man. 3. The bubble-like constitution of the human frame. The latter are 1 and 2. Infinite sight and hearing. 3. Unlimited power over the body. 4. Knowledge of the past stages of existence of all creatures. 5. Knowledge of the thoughts of all beings. And 6. Supernatural knowledge of the finality of life. Bubble-like constitution of the human frame. That's interesting. And number 5, the Japanese author is responsible for the name of this sutra. In my catalogue, number 158, there is one entitled Sutra of Buddha's Ascension to the Trayastrimsa heaven to preach the law for his mother's sake, BN. Number 6, Bhadra. And we move to, I think, the final set of 2 pages. Yeah, okay, so that's the end, but we have to go back to this side of the page. All right, so, Shuhaka, Handaka, Ragora, Nakasina, Inkata, Isunahashi, Ashta, and Shuda Handaka. And my cat wants to come in. Just a minute. I'll let her in. Come on then. There you go. Right. Sorry about that. Under the beneficent rule of Nanda, the Buddha traveled through many countries until he came to Bishara Vaisali, where he collected a multitude round him in the monastery of the great mango forest, Anrajiyen. More than 20,000 persons quitted the world to become monks. There was a certain wealthy man of the neighborhood named Gakkai, who was enormously wealthy and lived in a magnificent mansion, more like the dwelling of a private individual, but miserly, irreligious, and careless about his future condition. The Buddha resolved to effect his conversion, and accompanied by Anan, Ragura, Mokuren, Shubodai, and Ubarimitsu, went to visit him. Standing at the door, they presented their begging bowls and besought the miser to fill them. The rich man's heart was touched by the humility of him who had abandoned rank, wealth, and power, and piling up the whitest of rice on a coral dish, brought it to them with his own hands. The Buddha rejoiced at this sign of a better disposition and preached to him on the vanity of worldly riches, warning him of the fate which awaited those who failed to make use of their opportunities. Gakkai was deeply impressed with his words, and becoming ashamed of his former wickedness, not only was converted to Buddhism, but gave a large piece of land to the monastery Dairin Shoja and distributed large sums in charity to the poor and needy ones of his relatives. My cat is now playing with something. Oops. The rich man Shudatsu Sudatta of Shae, Sravasti, bought the gardens of Geta, and in conjunction with Gakkai, erected a huge monastery to which the name of Gion Shoja, Getavanna Vihara, the monastery of Geta's garden, to which Geta gave all the trees that stood on the land. Shaka passed the next 7 years at the Gion Shoja, preaching to the multitude who flocked together to hear him from all quarters of the compass, until his doctrine was accepted throughout India. He has now arrived at the age of 77, and knowing that his end was near, he returned with his disciples to Ryojusen. Surrounded by the 10 chief disciples, the 16 rakan, and 3,000 more of his immediate followers, and taking a kompara, kampila, flower in his hand, he told them that this blossom had 3 aspects. They were unable to comprehend his meaning, and sat silently thinking. At last, Kasho smiled and looked up at the sky. Shaka said, Kasho can carry on the work of this Mahayana, and handed him the flower, together with the gold-embroidered kesa. Next, he called Anand to him, and bidding him assist Kasho in teaching the truth, gave him his own begging bowl. Then he taught them to repeat certain mystic sentences. 18 months after this, Buddha quitted the monastery of Ryojusen, and coming to the city of Kushinagara, delivered his last teachings to his disciples as he sat between the 2 rows of teak trees, Sarasoju, Sanskrit Sala. In the beginning of the 2nd moon of the following year, he took to his couch, to the great grief and alarm of all the rakan, the priests, I think that is, who besought him to call in the aid of a physician. But he forbade them, saying that his time had now come. Let them, after his entry to nirvana, look upon Kasho as their teacher, and he would lead them in the way of attaining to that blissful state. The disciples lifted up their voices and wept, praying him to abide with them, yet the space of 1 kalpa. But he waved his hand as a negative, saying, Life has a limited span, and naught may avail to extend it. This is manifested by the impermanence of human beings. But yet, whenever necessary, I will hereafter make my appearance from time to time as a god, i.e. Shinto, a sage, Confucian, or a Buddha. After this, he spoke no more, and on the 15th day of the month, lying on his right side, with his head to the north, and his face looking west, he entered nirvana like one falling asleep in his 80th year. At the same moment, a brilliant light radiated from his corpse and illuminated the universe. The rakan from every place, the kings of all countries, the rishis, the magicians, and then we have the footnotes. 1. Panthaka. 2. Rahula. 3. Nagasena. 4. Chulapanthaka. The names of the others cannot be identified with certainty. The 16 rakan are probably those who went to live in 16 different places after Shaka's nirvana to teach the law. BN. Again, it's this mysterious BN. The lower ranks of disciples are classed as bhiksus or monks, bhikkhuni or nuns, ubasoku, and ubai, laymen and women who keep the 5 commandments, Sanskrit, Sank, Bhikshu, Bhikshani, Upasaka, and Upashika. These are Sanskrit names, I think. So we've got bhiksus, monks, bhikkhuni, nuns, ubasoku, and ubai, laymen and women. Okay. Next footnote. The 5 great Indian monasteries were the Gion Dairin, Chikarin, Satairin, and Naranda or Getavana, Mahavana, Vesuvana, Nalanda. Setarin has not been identified. Okay, just a moment. Go on, out. Thank you. Oh, sorry about that. Number six, footnote number six, the form of teaching which pervades the later discourses ascribed to the Buddha, they are not regarded as his authentic utterances. I wonder if Rishi Sunak is this name is same as Rishi. No, surely not. I think he's Hindu. All right. The Rakan from every place, the kings of all countries, the rishis, the magicians, and then we are on the final page, I think. And it's not a very long page, this one. You can see lots of emptiness. The fish of the Ganges, all animals, birds, and even insects wept, knowing this to be the sign that the Buddha had entered nirvana, crowded to the spot and bewailed their loss. Then all the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Indra and Brahma, the four Deva kings, and all the innumerable company of the Devas and good spirits, and even Amida from his pure land in the west, came riding on purple clouds to escort him to paradise. And the disciples, arising, carried his corpse to the bank of the river Bhattai, the Hiranyavati, flowing by the city of Kusinagara. They brought it into the monastery of Tenkwanji, Divya Malya Vihara, where they washed it with perfumed water and awaited the coming of Kasho. As soon as he arrived, the funeral was arranged, and millions of the people followed the coffin of the departed Buddha. Placing the coffin of the deceased teacher on a pyre of fragrant wood, they consumed it with pure fire, and from the ashes they recovered a countless number of sarira, or relics, resembling the diamond. These were divided among the kings, who carried them home and enshrined them in magnificent pagodas. N.B. The pamphlet from which this has been extracted was a republication of Mr. Sato's contribution to the Japan branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. Ed, meaning editor. All right, so we can stop the share now, if I can find where to do that. Whoops. Oh, there we are. Okay. So I thought that was very interesting. I was reading it for the first time, so I'm sorry if I stumbled a little bit. But I think what we've got here is Ernest Sato approaching Buddhism through a Japanese translation, if I've got that right. So, which is why we've got the Japanese names and then the Sanskrit names in brackets afterwards. I think it's rather an interesting approach, to say the least of it. And I'm not sure. I mean, there will be people perhaps who've listened to this and who are familiar with Sanskrit, and perhaps I'm sure my pronunciation was rather amateur, to say the least. But perhaps they could recognize some of their places and the concepts that were mentioned in Sanskrit from my reading of it. Maybe. I hope so. Okay, so I think it tells us a little bit more about Ernest Sato, that he was a really first-class scholar, and that he was able to consider approaching Buddhism through Japanese is pretty much a rarity for any European, I would think. I don't know of any others, but I think there must have been some. All right. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry about the interruption from the cat, but actually she was quite well behaved, really. And I hope she didn't spoil the video. Okay. Goodbye now. See you again soon. From the Northern Lights to you, wherever you are. Goodbye.